Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philly. I am your host, Caleb Watt, here with my very knowledgeable co-host, Pastor Doug. Hey, Doug, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Caleb. How about yourself?
A little bit tired, but aren't we all?
Oh, what a lead in there.
Wait, what a lead. That was actually kind of unintentional. I was like, I do feel a little bit tired. I'll say I'm kind of tired.
A little Freudian slip, I guess.
Yes, a Freudian slip. But also a perfect segue into our topic for today, which is
rest and not burning out.
Not burning out. So, P-Doug, how would you define burnout then in today's context? Yeah.
Well, before I say that, let me just back it up a little bit, explain why we're talking about this topic. The reason is that recently in our Miracles of Jesus series, we looked at Jesus's miraculous catch of fish. And the main idea that I talked about there is that Jesus invites us into his work, because that miracle ends with him telling Peter as well as the others there, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. He's saying, come and join me in this like kingdom work that I'm doing. And just as they miraculously caught so much fish, Jesus is saying to them, like, this is what you'll see in your own life as well. He's promising them that as they follow him and join Jesus in his work, they will see fish, they will see fruit from the ministry. But a question that I got after the message was, well, Jesus invites us into his ministry, and we know that like there should be nothing better than following him and doing like and participating, right, in the kingdom. But how do we do that in like a healthy way without burning out?
Right.
And I think that's a great question. It's obviously very pertinent because in our day-to-day, we really want to make sure that we do things in healthy, sustainable ways.
Right.
I think previous generations kind of pushed people in ways that maybe were unhealthy. Maybe you like squeezed them for all their worth during the season they were like involved in your church, but then once they like were burnt out, you sort of tossed them to the side. And the question for our day in ministry is, how can we do ministry though in a way that is fruitful but also sustainable?
I feel like that's a super pertinent question around so many levels. Like we can talk about like the burnout, right, of just like living a day-to-day life and like working or whatever. But like even in a, as you're saying, like a ministry sense, right? Like if you actually take a step back and look at all the hurts of the world, even the hurts of like one congregation or like how much work needs to be done, right? It becomes very, very overwhelming. And I'm sure you felt this as a pastor before, right?
Yep.
It's like, there's just so much to do. There's so many people who need counsel, who need to hear about Christ, who need to hear the gospel, right?
Yeah.
So then, of course, that just circles us back to this discussion, this topic which you introed for us. Like, how do we do this? Like both living our lives as Jesus called us to, and also serving in his body, right? And in the evangelistic sense too. How do we do all that in a healthy, sustainable way, in a way that that allows us to continue doing that without burning out?
Yeah. Very, very good questions. I think it's helpful to look at like this idea of burning out because people often talk about feeling like burnt out maybe from ministry, but I think or from like serving in the church. But I think the reality is people aren't necessarily burnt out from serving in the church. Maybe obviously some are, but I think a lot of people are just burnt out from the world, and then they feel tired because they don't know how to fit in like ministry on top of everything else that they are doing. And so when they do add on like more ministry, it just feels like they're adding on more work, more stuff that will take energy in their life, and then that makes them feel tired. But then they blame the ministry part of it, they blame the serving part of it because that feels like the extra part. But I think we need to look back at our lives and think like, how can we actually step back from other things that we're doing? Maybe we're too involved or putting too much focus on something else in our life, whether it be like our work, our jobs, or even our school. Obviously, we want to be faithful in those areas. I'm not saying like your student fail out of school if your work or like don't do your job. But I think we need to look at how we can make sure that we're being healthy in those areas as well. Because sometimes we're like, oh, we need healthy serving, but they're not thinking about how they can be like healthy in their like studies or healthy in their work as well. And I think the reality is many of us might be burning out from those other areas, and then we feel so much tired. And then when we think about how then we can serve on top of that.
Okay. So then I guess the question that leads me to think of next is like, how am I then able to like properly evaluate like what I need to get in line in a sense, right? Like I think there's talking about previous generations. I like reading old people like Bonhoeffer, and then a little bit of like, some Puritans too. But there's like this sense of like, I'm not saying that they explicitly say things like this, but there's a sense of like, oh, if you're suffering when you're like doing ministry, you're it's like the first Peter type of suffering. You're suffering for Christ's sake, right? Not suffering as a thief, suffering as a murderer, but you're suffering for Christ's sake. Yeah. And there's like even like this like idea, almost like Paul writing, for I take up in my body what Christ was lacking in his affliction, right? In like Colossians 1 or something like that. So it's like, how do I know when I'm looking at my life and my busyness and like my tiredness, whether I am suffering because I have something out of line, or I'm suffering because this is what Christ has called me to, if that makes sense.
Well, the suffering that Jesus and, in the New Testament writers are alluding to is more so suffering from persecution, right? Not necessarily suffering because you are physically draining yourselves beyond like, your ability to do anything. Obviously, we should work, in a sense where we actually are like, we don't want to be lazy with our lives, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think he's talking about like suffering from working hard.
Okay.
It's suffering because you are doing things that are rubbing against the flow of the world. But if we do align ourselves with Jesus, we should be rubbing up against the flow of the world. And that's why I mentioned that when we think about like our values and our alignment of time, maybe we are giving too much time for other things in our lives. And maybe we need to like think about how we can not be as like just all in those other areas in a way that's unhealthy. Because I think many people are more willing to like give up their time for their work or their schools than they are for actually like following Jesus.
Right.
And I think we need to think, well, what do I actually value then in my life? And then when you do that, maybe you actually have to, maybe you have to scale things back, and maybe you will rub against the world because your boss will be like, hey, how come you don't stay super late? Well, it's like, no, I'm not going to stay super late because I choose to use my time for Jesus as well. I don't want to be giving all my time and energy to this like company. And so, there's certain times that we need to rub up against the world if we truly value following Jesus in our lives.
So then what would you say to someone who feels, I'll try to contextualize within the responses that you've given so far, but it's like in the example of someone who's like, maybe, or we'll say someone who's in ministry, right? Even.
Yeah.
I think that's like the clearest example. It's like someone who's serving as like a pastor, or like someone who's lay staff, or like lay ministry or whatever, or someone who's just like very involved in church, like, and maybe as a college student or whatever, you feel like, there is a very strong call, right? To just serve. Like, how are they supposed to take the step back, right? From like looking at what they're doing with their lives and saying, oh, these are the parts where like maybe I can scale back, so then I have the energy to do ministry, when the things that they would scale back is the very ministry that they are serving in.
Well, like I would say that for someone who's like in full-time ministry, you just got to make sure that like you aren't tying your identity into the ministry you're doing. Because I think a lot of people in ministry work so hard in ministry because they feel like the success of the church is on them. And that's not a healthy way to look at it. But I think for most of us, most people who might be listening to this probably aren't necessarily in full-time ministry. And it's like, you gotta recognize that the work we do is valuable. Like, I'm not saying like, like work that's not full-time ministry is bad, but we need to be willing to like let go a little bit of the control we placed on our careers if we really want to follow Jesus like seriously with our lives. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to like be serving all the time, right? But it means that like we should look at our whole lives and think, how can I incorporate rest in my whole life, not just by scaling down like church things, but by scaling down all things. There should be like an equal sense of resting from all things in our lives.
Rest. That's I know like right before we started, we're like, okay, this is about burnout and not necessarily a discussion of rest yet, right? Because I feel like, rest in and of itself could merit its own like 40-minute episode or whatever. But I do think it's worthwhile to touch on for like very briefly,
Yeah.
right? Because like I know what for myself when I feel burnt out, one of the questions that I frequently ask Jesus is like, didn't you say that if I came to you, you would give me rest? Matthew 11:28, right? That your burden is easy, your yoke is light, right? And why is it so heavy now, right? Or even the idea that like in one sense, like Jesus says this in Matthew 11:28, and in Matthew 16:24, he's like, take up your cross, right? Like essentially like crucify yourself and follow me, right? That's not very restful at all.
Yeah.
So it's like in this sort of sense, and I do want to stay within the scope of our discussion. How does rest, like what does rest mean in serving,
Yeah.
right? And like following Jesus, right? What does rest mean in all this?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. I think the reality is that like rest is an elusive thing, because when we like think of rest as purely like sitting around, like not doing much, like less activity per se, we're never going to feel rested. I think true rest is found in aligning our passions with like what we do with our lives. Because the reality is, if you do something that really matters to you, you kind of lose sense of time, and you don't really mind that you're utilizing your energy for it, right? If you are, say, if you love, like, I love snowboarding, right? When I go snowboarding, like maybe I feel like physically tired, but I feel good afterwards because I've done something that I really enjoy. And when we really enjoy Jesus, like he is our rest. Come to me, right? He says, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. He's not saying I will give you nothing to do, like you're just gonna like sit around, but he's saying I'm going to give you something more meaningful than what you were doing before. Something that will actually fill your heart, fill your soul, right? Because sometimes, we do things and we feel like our soul is filled. Like I remember one of the times when I first really came to know Jesus, there was like a worship night. It was like a passion conference way back. And I remember afterwards feeling like so good, so filled, because I finally like found real delight in worship. And maybe I was a little like physically tired, but spiritually I felt like alive. I felt like alive because I was doing something that really I really valued, that really just felt like it just fulfilled like so much in my soul. And I think we've had experiences of that. And that's what Jesus is saying, like find rest, find true fulfillment and true like meaning in your life in him. But it's found through following him, not through a lack of activity, because he even says, my yoke, like meaning take on my yoke, meaning like do his work, because doing his work is rest for us because it gives us purpose to our lives. And I think for a lot of people, what they're not lacking is not rest. They're not feeling burnt out necessarily. They're actually feeling directionless. I think a lot of people feel purposeless and directionless. And when you do something that you don't understand why you're doing it, you're going to feel tired doing it. Like if you are told by like someone to go do some chore that does not matter to you, it's going to feel burdensome to you, right? Because when you do something that doesn't matter to you, when you do something without purpose behind it, it feels even more tiring. And I think for most people, that's the reality they face, is that they're not burnt out per se. It's just that they actually are directionless. They're purposeless. They're not really sure what they're doing with their lives. And I think for Jesus, he's saying, find purpose, find meaning, find fulfillment in me. Take on my yoke, right? My burden is light. My yoke is easy. Take it on though. Follow me. Do the work that I'm leading you, because that is rest. Doing something that really matters.
Wow. So then I think you know where the next question is going. Like, how do we know what Jesus is calling us to? Right? How do I hear the Lord's promptings and follow him and obey? And I mean this in like, because as you're saying, right, it's very true. It's like if I don't understand why I'm doing something, then it feels meaningless. Like why am I doing it? It's like Ecclesiastes, vanities of vanities, right? But there's also like a sense in which like, like I remember I would say like as a younger Christian, like perhaps like early in college, it's like, oh, there's these commands in the Bible. I know I should I either do these things or not do these things because, well, it's listed as a sin, right? But I don't understand why. And it's only until later when, I get it now, right? Then you do it with rejoicing, you do it with joy. But it's like in that like season of like, okay, there are certain things that like whether that's like with a command or like with serving, I feel like God's calling me to do this, but I don't understand why yet. How do we I guess struggle through that, work through that to then ultimately see the purpose behind it, or like understand whether or not Christ is actually calling us to something.
Yeah. Well, I think rather than focusing on the what he's calling us to, start with Jesus, right? He even says in that, that passage in the Gospels we've been alluding to a bunch, is the first thing he says is, come to me. And I think for many of us, we just are skipping ahead to like, what I got to do, but we haven't actually come to Jesus and seen him. And that's why I mentioned, I think a lot of us, we feel burnt out, tired because we feel purposeless, directionless. And what that means is we need to come to Jesus and know him again. Return to your first love. Because I think a lot of us, we get so ahead with like tasks and things we need to get done that we forget who Jesus is and the reason why we do what we do. And so beyond saying like, oh, how do you discern what to do, what task he's calling you to do, we got to return to him, come to Jesus, and remember why we follow him, because he is good. He is our savior. He laid down his life for us. He calls us like into his arms to be accepted by him, to be loved by him, to be cared for by him. He is the one who will carry us through this life. We got to remember him. He's the one who died on our behalf, died for our sins and said that we are forgiven. And, we want to remember this goodness that's in Jesus, because when we remember this goodness, that allows us to be like, I want to just follow him, right? Because you want to be with someone who's like truly good. We delight in spending time with people who make us feel better. And Jesus is the one who should make us feel better than anyone else in this world. And so we should delight in being with him. And if we don't, that means we need to go back and remember who he is.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way of like concluding, right, this thought, where it's like, understanding purpose, right? Like having it's almost like the question of like, what gives you meaning in life, or what is the purpose in your life, right? And like I think one of the thoughts that I've had more recently, or that I was meditating on, is like, what makes Jesus worth it, right? And when he's worth it, then there's a very like you can do a lot, right? All that he calls you to, because he also again takes up the yoke with us. Yeah. Do you have any concluding thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, just
before we wrap up?
Remember, like, Jesus is our rest. Rest is not found through inactivity or a lack of activity. It's found in Jesus. So if we're looking for rest, we need to go to Jesus, because as we remember who he is, we can delight in him in the times that we're just quiet alone with him, but also delight in him in the times that we are active for him. And that's where we find like a good wholeness to our lives, as we both delight in him in the quiet place, but we also follow him in the mission that he is calling us to. And there's this like rhythm, this back and forth to it. And we see that in Jesus' own life, right?
Yeah.
He does things, but he also escapes alone. And I think we should follow that same model. Escape alone with Jesus, because he is our rest, but also follow him, because we find rest even in doing the work that he does. We find delight in doing the work that he does. Yeah.
Right. Well, I have thoughts about that too. But we were coming up against the end of our time. And so I'll just say thank you very much for tuning in today to this episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. If you're new here, you can go check us out at philly.gracecovenant.net. And please join us on Sundays in Meyerson on Penn's campus for this fall semester. We're going through the miracles of Jesus. And wow, some great questions that he has produced so far for us to discuss here on this podcast.
Keep them coming.
Yeah, keep them coming. Keep them coming, please. But thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you next time.